Folks in Red Mesa used to say the wind carried secrets, but the morning Caleb Rourke rode in, it carried something meaner, the kind of silence that settles before a gunshot. He came over the ridge at first light, hat pulled low, coat flapping like a tattered flag of war, and the rising sun burned behind him so fierce it made him look like Judgment, riding a sorrel stallion. The sign outside town creaked on rusty chains. Red Mesa, population not near enough to matter. And as his horse's hooves struck the hard-packed earth of Main Street, every curtain twitched, every poker game paused. Every man who had ever done wrong felt the past come calling. Caleb had not always been a hard man. Once he had been just a ranch hand with a crooked grin and a promise to build a house near Willow Creek, a place where cottonwoods whispered instead of screamed. But that was before the fire, before the smoke swallowed the sky and left nothing but blackened beams where his family's ranch had stood. Before the graves were dug under a merciless August sun. Folks said it was bandits, others said it was business. Caleb knew it was Elias Boone, the cattle baron who owned half the territory and all the law that mattered. Boone wanted the Rourke land, and Boone got what he wanted. The saloon door slapped open as Caleb stepped inside the Lucky Spur, dust trailing behind him like ghosts unwilling to let go. The piano player missed a note. Whiskey glasses hovered halfway to lips, and Sheriff Tom Avery stiffened near the bar. Avery had once been Caleb's friend, had once shared coffee by campfires, and sworn they would watch each other's backs. Now a silver star pinned to his chest weighed heavier than any friendship. Caleb's eyes met his, cold and steady, and the whole room felt like dry grass waiting for a spark. "I ain't here for trouble," Caleb said, voice low as distant thunder, though the Colt at his hip told another story. "I'm here for Boone." The name hung in the air like smoke. A rancher in the corner muttered a prayer. Another slipped out the back door. Sheriff Avery swallowed hard and set his glass down slow. "Boone's up at his place," he replied, careful and measured. "And if you're aiming to stir up old ghosts, you best think twice." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Ghosts don't scare me, Tom. Men do." Elias Boone's ranch spread across the valley like a kingdom carved from greed. White fences gleaming under the sun, cattle grazing fat and lazy, and at its heart a grand house with tall windows that looked down on everything like it owned the horizon. Caleb rode through the open gate without invitation, dust rising behind him in defiance. Ranch hands watched from a distance, hands hovering near holsters but not daring to draw. They had heard the stories of Caleb Rourke, the man who survived the fire, the man who hunted rustlers across 3 territories and left none to brag about it. Boone himself stepped out onto the porch, silver hair slicked back, vest buttoned tight over a belly grown prosperous on other men's losses. His smile was thin as a blade. "Well, I'll be damned," Boone called out, "if it ain't the prodigal rancher." Caleb swung down from his saddle, boots hitting dirt with purpose. "You took my land," he said plain. No flourish, no tremble. "And you took my family." Boone shrugged like it was weather talk. "Business is business. Son, you couldn't pay your debts." Caleb's eyes burned. "My father's ledger was clean." Boone's smile faltered just a touch before another word could be traded. The front door creaked open and she stepped out. Clara Boone, the daughter folks whispered about, not for scandal but for spirit. She wore a simple blue dress, hair tied back against the wind, and her gaze was nothing like her father's, where his eyes were flint. Hers were clear water, steady and searching. She looked at Caleb, not with fear but with something close to recognition, as if she too had been waiting for this reckoning. "Father," she said softly, "maybe it's time to talk instead of threaten." Boone waved her off, but Caleb could not look away. Caleb had come to Red Mesa with vengeance carved into his bones, every mile of trail feeding the fire in his chest. He had imagined this moment 100 times, imagined drawing his gun, imagined Boone falling into the dust he had forced others to swallow. Yet as Clara's eyes held his, something shifted, not forgiveness, not mercy, but doubt, the kind that sneaks in when hate has burned too long. Boone laughed harsh and called for his men. Hands reached for rifles, and the valley held its breath. Caleb's fingers brushed the grip of his Colt, and in that heartbeat between past and future, he realized vengeance might cost more than he had left to give. The wind rose sharp and wild, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that felt less like death and more like destiny waiting just beyond the next draw of a gun. The valley did not breathe easy. When Boone's men reached for their rifles, it braced like a horse sensing the spur. Caleb's hand rested on his Colt, but he did not draw. Not yet. The wind pushed dust between them, thin as a curtain at a wake. Clara stepped down from the porch, boots crunching soft against gravel, and placed herself square between Caleb and the firing line. "No," she said, not loud but certain, and it carried farther than Boone's barked orders ever had. Ranch hands hesitated, eyes shifting from their employer to the woman who had patched their wounds and read to their children by lamplight. Boone's face flushed the color of raw beef. "Get inside, Clara," he snapped. But she stood firm as fence post in a storm. Caleb felt the old rage claw at his ribs, urging him to end it in smoke and blood. Yet something in Clara's stance steadied him. "I came for answers," he said, voice hard but not reckless. "Not a slaughter," Boone scoffed. "You came for trouble." But Caleb shook his head slow. "You burned my ranch." The words hung heavy, the accusation clear as noon sun. Boone's gaze flickered, just for a blink, and that flicker told Caleb more than denial ever could. Sheriff Avery rode into the yard then, breathless from the climb, badge glinting, uneasy. "That's enough," Avery called, though even he sounded unsure of who he was speaking to. Clara turned to her father, eyes fierce in a way Caleb had not expected. "Tell him the truth," she demanded. Boone laughed sharp and hollow. "Truth is for church, girl. This is land and cattle." But Clara did not look away. "I saw the ledger," she said, voice trembling now but unbroken. "The Rourke debt was paid. You forged the notice." A silence deeper than any canyon opened between them. Caleb felt it like a bullet grazing skin. Not yet pain, but promise of it. Boone's men shifted, uncomfortable, some lowering their rifles a fraction. Boone's jaw tightened. "You know nothing of what it takes to build an empire," he growled. Caleb stepped forward one measured pace, boots grinding gravel. "Empire built on ashes ain't worth ruling," he said. The sheriff swallowed, knowing the accusation had teeth. Clara's confession struck like lightning across dry land, and for the first time Boone looked less like a king and more like a man cornered by his own making. Yet pride is a stubborn beast, and Boone had fed his too long to let it starve now. "You think you can waltz in here and take what's mine?" Boone sneered. "I own this valley." Caleb's voice dropped low. "You own fear. That's all." Boone's pride snapped like a pulled rein. He drew his revolver in one swift motion, the sun flashing against steel, and the ranch hands froze. Caleb's Colt cleared leather just as fast, the valley erupting in the echo of a single shot. It was Sheriff Avery who fired first, aiming not to kill but to stop, his bullet striking Boone's wrist and sending the weapon spinning into dust. Boone cried out, clutching his hand, rage twisting into something uglier. The ranch hands lowered their rifles at last, loyalty bending under the weight of truth and blood. Clara rushed to her father's side, tearing fabric from her sleeve to wrap his wound, hands steady despite the tremor in her breath. Caleb watched, heart pounding not from fear, but from the strange ache that comes when vengeance slips through your fingers. He could have fired, could have ended Boone where he stood, and no jury in the territory would have wept for the cattle baron. Yet he did not. The fire that had carried him this far now gutted in the face of something he did not fully understand. Clara looked up at him over her father's shoulder, gratitude and accusation mingling in her gaze. Sheriff Avery dismounted slow, revolver still raised but voice calm. "Elias Boone, you're under arrest for fraud and arson," he said, the words sounding almost foreign in the wide-open yard. Boone spat in the dirt. "You think a badge makes you brave?" Avery answered quietly. "No. It just reminds me what I ought to be." He motioned for two ranch hands to step forward, and to Caleb's surprise, they obeyed, binding Boone's uninjured wrist with rope. The empire that had seemed untouchable only moments before now looked fragile as dry timber as they led Boone toward the waiting horse. Clara stood, wind tugging strands of hair loose around her face. The yard felt emptier already, as if the valley itself had exhaled. Caleb holstered his gun and met her eyes once more. "I didn't come to hurt you," he said, rough honesty in every word. Clara studied him like a horizon she had not yet decided to cross. "You came for vengeance," she replied softly. "But you chose something else." Caleb did not answer, because he was not sure what that something else was, only that it stood before him in a blue dress beneath a ruthless sun. And as the sheriff rode off with Boone bound behind him, Caleb realized his war had ended, yet a different kind of reckoning was only just beginning, one that no gun could settle and no ledger could balance. Boone's trial came swift as a summer storm, held in the small courthouse at the edge of Red Mesa. where the walls still smelled of fresh pine and nervous sweat. Word traveled fast across the territory. Men rode in from neighboring ranches. Women filled the benches in quiet clusters. And for once, it was not cattle prices folks came to discuss, but justice. Sheriff Avery stood tall beside the judge's desk, badge polished like he meant to earn it proper this time. Caleb took a seat in the back, hat in his hands, while Clara sat near the front. Spine straight as a rifle barrel, Boone entered in shackles. Pride, the only thing not chained, the evidence stacked high as hay bales. Forged documents, altered ledgers, testimony from ranch hands who had finally found their nerve. Clara herself stood and spoke clear as church bells, telling how she had discovered the falsified debt notice, how her father had ordered the fire under cover of night, each word costing her something precious. Boone never looked at her while she spoke, perhaps because he could not. When the verdict came, guilty on every count, the murmur in the courtroom rolled like distant thunder. Boone was sentenced to years behind iron bars in the territorial prison, his empire carved away piece by piece to repay those he had wronged. Caleb thought the verdict would bring peace, but vengeance has a strange echo, even when it is satisfied by law instead of lead. He returned to the charred remains of his family's ranch, where weeds had grown tall between blackened beams, and stood there until dusk painted the sky red as old scars. Clara rode out to find him, not in silk but in riding trousers, hair tied back against the wind. "You planning to rebuild?" she asked, voice gentle but not pitying. Caleb stared at the land that had once been laughter and supper bells. "Don't know if I got the strength," he admitted, and that confession felt heavier than any gun he had ever carried. Clara dismounted and walked beside him through the ruins, boots crunching over ash long settled. "Strength ain't something you find," she said quietly. "It's something you decide." She spoke of selling part of her inherited holdings to repay families harmed by her father's greed, of turning the Boone ranch into something honest, something earned. Caleb listened, surprised by the steel beneath her softness. She was not her father's shadow. She was the dawn after his long night. And standing there amid the wreckage, Caleb felt something unfamiliar take root. Not rage, not sorrow, but the fragile beginnings of hope. Rebuilding a ranch is slower than tearing one down. It takes sweat instead of fire, and patience instead of fury. Caleb and Clara worked side by side through the changing seasons, raising beams, mending fences, driving cattle across land once claimed by fear. The people of Red Mesa watched from a distance at first, wary of the strange alliance between a wronged rancher and the daughter of the man who wronged him. But time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, and soon neighbors arrived with tools and timber, offering help without being asked. Redemption, it seemed, could spread wider than guilt one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in gold. Caleb found himself standing outside the nearly finished house, Clara beside him, her hand brushing his by accident, or maybe not. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly, not shooting him. Caleb thought long before answering, the memory of that yard still vivid as a brand mark. "Every day," he said, honest, then added, "and every day I'm glad I didn't." Clara smiled at that, a small curve of lips that held more forgiveness than words ever could. In that quiet space between them, something unspoken became understood. Caleb had come to Red Mesa with a single purpose, vengeance etched deep in his bones. Yet as he reached into his coat pocket weeks later, the small velvet box felt stranger than any weapon he had ever drawn. He found Clara near Willow Creek, where cottonwoods whispered the way they used to. "I ain't much for speeches," he began, hat in hand, "but I know this. Life's too short to chase ghosts when there's something living worth holding on to." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, not flashy, not grand, but honest, forged from melted heirloom pieces salvaged from both their pasts. Clara's breath caught like a startled mare. "I came here to end a man," Caleb said, voice rough with truth, "but I found something worth beginning instead." The creek murmured approval, wind rustling through leaves like quiet applause. Clara stepped forward, eyes shining brighter than the valley at dawn. "Yes," she answered, and slipped the band onto her finger, sealing not just a promise but a reckoning transformed. In time their wedding was held beneath the open sky. The whole town gathered not out of curiosity but respect, Sheriff Avery standing proud as witness, and as Caleb slid a ring onto Clara's hand, he understood something that had taken him miles of dust and years of grief to learn. Vengeance may light the trail, but love is what carries a man home.